Well, thank you everybody for joining. So today we're going to talk about module federation with Sitecore XM Cloud. Um, First, a little bit about myself. Boston-based solution architect with about 13 years of experience. It's hard to count at this point. So I think everyone usually goes from the version, so I'll say version 6.4 of Sitecore. And yeah, just been working with Niche Tech for a couple weeks now as I transition to that company. Do some great work over there on the cloud space. And I think over time, I've been really passionate about front end. So it's great to kind of see how technology has kind of started to realign with the front end even closer than it has before as things start getting a lot more dynamic. So top right of the screen, you can just feed my website, my personal website, techappetite.com. A little bit of a foodie, that's why it's labeled as so, and then my LinkedIn profile as well. And then what kind of presentation it would be without the dog tax. This is my golden cavadoodle. It's really is a golden retriever. His name's Flynn. Let's kick right into it. So for those that don't know what a micro front end, basically just think about a website or web app as a composition of features. And those features should be broken down into different verticals. In a monolithic structure without micro front ends, you're looking at a single mono repository where you might have some NPM packages and it serves all the purposes and features of the website. In a micro front end atmosphere, you're separating those out into different verticals and you're allowing the features to have really their own business and missions specialized around those. So you could have, like you see in this diagram I put together here, you could have a team for exploring, a team for catalog or products, and a team for checkout, right? So they all have different types of functionality, but at the core, they're really trying to achieve their own type of mission. At the core of this, really, you want to be technologically agnostic, but avoid any type of framework anarchy around it. You don't want to be choosing too many frameworks just based on what your own ideologies are. And then establishing really just team prefixes and how resilient you want your code to be. Because at the end of the day, your website still needs to perform. So the more type of front end magic that you put into it, the more layers and more complexity it has, the harder that technical debt becomes. So this introduces module federation, again, which is I abbreviate as MF. And I consider this to be, through my research so far, one of the leading patterns of micro front-end architecture. I provide a link also, just to be fair, for the other micro front-end implementations, which they range from SPA applications to AWS Lambda functions that host Next.js routes. So those are some of the other patterns. I'll get into MF a little bit more. But the idea behind it is that you're sharing code across JavaScript applications at runtime. This module federation it's really a framework in itself. It provides comprehensive tools for enabling that framework capabilities, and we'll talk about that next and what that pattern looks like. So from an architecture standpoint, we want to, priority number one is to build applications that compose a unified experience. Even though we have different verticals, it should come together and really have one type of experience for the end user. And then team anatomy, this allows your team, like I said before, to work independently, but you're sharing code seamlessly. Another purpose of that is the deployments. So you could have separate CI/CD processes if you wanted to. Your code could be separated and you could have faster builds, kind of like what Sitecore has started to do with their between their XM cloud deployments of the Sitecore application versus the rendering host. And then lastly, testing. These applications, they can stand alone without the host, which I'll also demo. And then quickly, just the benefits. I mentioned this before, but your application that controls everything can import components from other applications at runtime. So there's some code sharing that happens. There's a lot of black magic behind the box from Webpack or TurboPack, whatever you choose. And then there's also shared libraries. So you could have, a shared internationalization library between two different libraries, and that's handled by this framework as well. Your React version as well, or any of the Next.js framework specifics as well. And then really there's the version management. You can also handle those versions. So I've seen examples. If you type in module federation, you'll get to the GitHub channel. They'll have examples directly in there. One of those examples, oddly enough, is a application that runs React version 17, 18, and 19 all together as one application, but they can also be ran separately. In that scenario, those routes are handled differently, different routes for those applications. And I'll show a diagram of that in a second. All right, so the ecosystem has grown a lot in its timeline of about 2 years. Zachary Jackson, who's the creator of Module Federation, worked exclusively with Webpack and started shifting into this ideology of micro front ends. So he created Module Federation as a core NPM package, and that encompasses today what you see here in this diagram I created. It's tooling, so type generation, dev tools, experimental options, manifest versus remote entry. So a manifest is when you expose your applications. Let me send you. Yeah, so when you expose your modules from one application, they're read in through this manifest file on the other application that has all of its different information to it. Now, Module Federation, it works with different plugins too. So, where a lot of us are used to Webpack or TurboPack, if you're up to speed on some of the front end sides of it. But there's also RSPack and Vite are some of the other build tools that also work with it. If you're doing Next.js development in particular, that actually has its own plugin. So you wouldn't use Webpack by itself, even though Next.js has Webpack built into it. So it's a different type of process if you're using this with Next.js applications. It also has a standalone SDK for this NPM package. So you could do a lot of custom things if you wanted to get into trouble. And then from a delivery standpoint, you could hypothetically, if these were all SSG-based applications, you could host these directly on a CDN as long as they have access to the manifest file location when they're built, or you could host them on Vercel, or there's specific micro front-end delivery systems like Zephyr Cloud that handle the building of those applications. If they're separate, are a little bit easier. But for the most part, you could use Vercel still. And Vercel, actually, I'll talk about Vercel in a second, but they have their own ideology behind this. Just very briefly, the Module Federation roles in a nutshell is really just you have a producer and a consumer. You can have multiple producers. A producer is considered the remote application. So you could have, say, for example, you have a catalog of products. Maybe that's its own remote application. Maybe you have a checkout application as well. That's also considered an application that exposes its modules. So the catalog application could expose like a product detail component and maybe a service for the product detail, if it has its own, API system with it. And then the consumer application, maybe that's your Sitecore application. Who knows? Maybe we might see a demo of that. But really, the consumer is what really consumes those remote modules. Kind of very similar to what you would do with like a NPM package of a component library. Before I get into more about the demo, some of the constraints you should be aware of, and what I found while looking through this is that there was like a quarrel between Vercel and Zachary Jackson, the creator of Module Federation. And the support of it is back in progress. I think maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago it was on hold just to continue supporting versions above version 15. Now the support, it's limited, but it's very much subject to change. It works with SSR, it works with SSG, but with SSG, your remote applications, wherever you're hosting them, they have to be available at build time. Otherwise, those changes won't be reflected during a full rebuild of the host application. My example, I'm just for testing purposes and demo purposes, will be in SSR. And then kind of just like Sitecore, and ironically, this was a good use case for us, but it currently supports page routers only. And it's already changed. If you see the top right of the screen where it says script alchemy updated on July 10th, that was 7 days ago. He already has core implementations for the app router as well. So that's already changed. They're already working. He's already working with Vercel to make those updates. So Vercel has no opposition to support this, this federation, as long as it doesn't become too much of like a resource drain, doesn't drastically alter the product. Now, with that said, Next.js being owned by Vercel now, Vercel literally just came out last week with this micro-front-end GitHub. Now, you have to speculate a little bit that Zachary Jackson kind of put onto something big here as Vercel's moving really fast with it. So not a lot of people have seen this, but this is a good opportunity to take a peek at it if you want to deploy those applications to Vercel. So I just took a quick screenshot of this that shows how Vercel deploys those. So they have a root application, and then they have a content and a navigation and a couple other applications, and all those producer applications work within that root application. And then lastly, the module federation versus an NPM package. You might be asking like, well, I'm used to just doing like NPM packages inside of this area or inside of our application. Maybe the client has a component library and it's GitHub or NPM package generated. Well, module federations don't really block anything like that. It can consume those NPM packages inside of your verticals. So the purpose of the module federation modules is not only to be a package to be consumed, but it has omnidirectional routing to it. So you can have that full entire application be managed even from an infrastructure level as a single page application or a SPA in its own project or its own vertical. And then lastly, it allows you to have remote components be shared. So you can have shared state, and I'll show that in the demo too. Okay, so a general overview of the use cases. Multiple hosts, so you can expose Sitecore data to existing module federation architectural teams. One of the business development use cases that I came across was, for example, was a company that had over 20, I think 14 to 20 Next.js applications that were managed by different teams. And they were wondering how they could integrate with Sitecore while keeping all of their Next.js applications siloed, keeping all of their logic in place. They have thousands of lines of code inside of their applications to get, page data and component level things working. So this is a perfect scenario where module federation comes into play and how you can integrate that with Sitecore. So I'll go over that in one of the diagrams coming up. Scenario one is a scenario that I put together just at language agnostic, right? You can have a SPA that uses Angular, it uses React, and it uses Byte. And those components go into that host application and use different apps. So you can see down here, like when you go to /products, maybe it has app3 module in the content area, and app3 is a Byte component, whereas app1 is an Angular component that uses the header. Scenario 2 is app by route. And this is what I was just talking about that implementation with the client with over 14 Next.js applications. So the idea behind that is you have a proxy server that handles the routing, maybe from a local development standpoint. And then you might have Azure Front Door or something else handling that route trafficking to different types of applications. But not talking about an infrastructure level. Really, based on the request, on the left-hand side, you go to /catalog, and that will route you to the catalog Next.js application that's managed by the client, but they need to insert the Sitecore header and the Sitecore footer and maybe some other Sitecore components inside of their application. Previously, you might be able to use like the item service API, or you could use the Edge API outside of Sitecore, which is one of the kind of the recent things that was released. But I'm going to show a different way how to do this. That doesn't require, if you have 14 Next.js applications, you don't want to have to import like the Sitecore NPM packages or Sitecore JSS packages inside of all of these projects and tell them that these are the dependencies for it. So we'll go over that. That's app by route. Don't forget that name. And then scenario 3, that's our Sitecore host. So in this scenario, we also discovered this a little bit, that Sitecore is the host of all routes, the pages, everything. When the request comes into Sitecore, it's going to remotely consume at runtime all of the catalog components. So you can see here, when a request comes in, you have the Sitecore header, and then you have a Sitecore component, maybe in the left rail. And then in the right rail, there's a catalog component being injected into the Sitecore rendering host application. There's also remote types. So a lot of times we're working with TypeScript. You can generate your types manually. Here's an example of declaring a module for MF catalog. That's usually the syntax we use for module federation. Catalog being one of those modules. And then you can generate remote types using a certain package that's non-Next.js related. It is kept up there for reference, but let's skip that. You can generate remote types with Next.js applications using this module federation / TypeScript. When you run the application and it's compiled, it generates the types for all of the consuming modules, everything that it's consuming from all the remotes underneath the @mf types area. So I'll show that in this next slide. So this might be familiar to some of you. You have the head apps Next.js starter directory, and underneath there, that's Sitecore rendering host. You can see here it's generated these mef types that come from a different project. And then for reference purposes, if you want to follow along with any of this and do this like step by step, I have a 3-part series, soon to be 4, on what we're talking about today. So part 1 through 3 are down there, and then some references above if you want to take a look a little bit more and deep dive into module federation. I did collaborate on some of this with Jarrett Long as well, so I just want to give a shout out to him as well. Okay, let's dive into scenario 3, the Sitecore host. I'll go ahead and open the application. Let's see if the screen is still being shared here. Awesome. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you can't see my screen. It should be VS Code's open. Awesome. All right. Let's zoom in on this a little bit, so it's a little bit easier to see. All right. So for this demo, this is a mono repo structure. I didn't have to do it this way, but it's a little bit easier to have everything underneath the same source repo root. So at the top level, we have a catalog application which houses our product components. Pretty straightforward. It's got a couple components down here using TypeScript. And then we have our marketing application. This is our Sitecore rendering host. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to fire up these applications, and we're going to see how the catalog components are injected into the Sitecore marketing application. So what I'll do first, I have my different PowerShell windows here. I'm going to fire up the catalog first. So I'll do npm run dev. That's going to run on port 3001. So we can go ahead and check that first. Now, what you don't normally see with Sitecore is this manifest link. So when you use module federation as a plugin, it generates this manifest link for other applications to reference to find out where it needs to actually get its components from. So with that said, we go ahead and refresh this page. And zoom in a little bit. You can see here that this location is quite active, right? It could be stored in the CDN online if you want to deploy it that way. So it's available to the Sitecore application from a deployment or CI/CD perspective. This really shows you from a manifest level, what is my module? What are its shared libraries? By default, these are Next.js specific framework shared libraries that automatically get added to this by default. No type of configuration that you need to add, like Next Dynamic for importing dynamic components asynchronously, which is what we're doing here. And then all the way at the bottom, keep scrolling down, you'll see some more component level things. So exposes is a section, a part of our application from the MF catalog. So this is the non-local, so port 3001 is the catalog application. This is the non-Sitecore Next.js application. That's exposing a banner component, a counter component, favorite dropdown, and a product CTA featured list. So let's go ahead and just load this page by itself with not even Sitecore running. So there's no catch-all route that I created. I just created a route called catalog for this Next.js application. And notice how right now there's no Sitecore headers or anything in there. This is just the Next.js application running by itself. So it's got some default data to it. You can see, for example, the button says like, it kind of looks like a dictionary key. That's just because it's not actually hooked up to Sitecore right now. It's not being injected into the Sitecore application. So by itself, it's just using dummy data. There's really not a lot going on here. So let's go ahead and go back to code and let's go to the Sitecore terminal. And let's fire up the Sitecore application, which is the not the catalog, the marketing, called the MF marketing is Sitecore. MF catalog is the regular Next.js app. So we'll start that. You can see here, there's a lot of familiar things like registering JSS components. I do have the Webpack logging level enabled. So there's going to be a lot of information here that isn't really necessary, helpful from a build perspective. So it's downloading the types. So they're going to be the TypeScript files that allow you to import those components. So if you look at kind of like the change history, you can see here it's generated this PDP service, all those types of interfaces that are inside of the external application. And now what we'll do is we'll go over to the Sitecore application. Just need to unpin this. Okay. All right, so this is the Sitecore application running on port 3000. And inside of here, you can see there's a pretty big difference between the two, right? This was just the components on the catalog app, but on the Sitecore marketing app, what we've done here is there's some outlines for components. So the red components are the Sitecore components, like the header, and the orange/yellow outlines are for components inside of the catalog app. So what we're doing here is we're using state management called Zustand, and we're sharing that module library across the two components, the store, basically the state store for that to handle favorites. You can see here by default, it had 2 items in here. And the reason being is that I have like local storage enabled for that state management. So you can see here, like the favorites icon is already enabled. And there's our products right there. So even though we're inside of the Sitecore application, we're basically injecting these components at runtime using module federation. And then inside of this catalog component, you can see here that the dictionary item is now enabled. We're using the Sitecore dictionary translation provider inside of the catalog component and passing all of that data through. You can also change the localization for it from English to Spanish. And you can see here that the localization is actually working inside of these components. So Spanish test title instead of English, Gafas de Sol. We can go back to English and see that update. All right. So that's pretty cool, exposing the components. Let's go into Sitecore and let's go to XM Cloud and let's look at the page from Sitecore pages. All right, so we have a Micro-Frontends project with the product site. I'm just going to go ahead and go right into the page builder mode. I have my localhost 3000 set for proxying the editing middleware instead of going directly to the default editing host. Just need to refresh the page, I think. There we go. So it's kicked into play here. So this is quite editable. This is not even a Sitecore rendering host component. This is a catalog component. But just like what you would do with a client component library, you pass in the React nodes to make that data editable. So all this information here is done the same way with module federation components. Let's go back to the application. Now, very quickly, I don't want to go too much into the code of it, but the right-hand side is the Sitecore application. So let's look at the left-hand side, which is the non-Sitecore application. This is going to be our application that's exposing components to Sitecore. So we have the way that it's set up is there's a separate JS file for module federation. And you can see down here, I have a bunch of options for exposes. So I'm exposing a banner component, basically all these components inside of my application and making them available to the Sitecore component. So Sitecore, we're using wrappers in this scenario. I'm also exposing a service to Sitecore too. So the way that, if we look in Sitecore, go ahead and make sure this jumps over to it. We can look at one of the components in Sitecore that utilizes the Sitecore rendering, to insert the component into the placeholder. We have some catalog wrapper components that match the components inside of the non-Sitecore application. And realistically, all it's doing is doing a dynamic import from the federated component. So we have our federated component here, and inside of there, I'm doing some like extra, things inside of Sitecore, but the rest of it is handled by that component, with an additional like suspense fallback for a loader using like React loading skeleton. But really, most of the work is done by that federated component. So let's go ahead and go to in the Sitecore side. You can also implement wildcard pages. So if I click on the eyeglasses product 1, what we're doing here is we're completely using a PDP service that comes from the catalog application. And we are getting data from the catalog application and returning it to a product detail component that lives in the catalog application, but renders in the Sitecore application. So that's like the verticals that I was talking about earlier, where all the work you're doing is inside of this catalog application. And it's still outside of Sitecore. So from a code perspective, I won't show too much of that, but let's go ahead and go into the product detail component. And you can see here that I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm importing a PDP service from the catalog application, which is outside of Sitecore. And I'm retrieving this additional data on the server side inside of Sitecore's get server side props. So that's your component level data fetching. That's for the server side. And so I'm basically passing along the request path to this module federated service that's now available to me in Sitecore, and I'm getting back some product data from that. So that request to that service actually goes through the API, the Next.js API of the other application. So when that request goes in, we look at the terminal of the catalog application. You can check out right here that this API PDP slug path was just hit from outside of Sitecore. So there's a lot of black magic that happens here, but at the end of the day, we know that the non-Sitecore application is doing all of the heavy lifting and bringing it all back to Sitecore. All of the source code, a lot of the source code is available in GitHub as well, so I don't want to kind of throw too much out there, but I do want to show how this works from a different perspective too. So let me go back here and see if there's anything else that I might have missed from this perspective. We'll go back home. This is set up in Sitecore as, you want to see the content editor real quick. This is just set up as an SXA site. The catalog page exists with just a Sitecore header, whereas the home page, the one that we see right here, this home page for Sitecore has, it has the header and additional components. As I said before about the catalog wrapper, we have a header and we have a component or a Sitecore component that acts as a wrapper or an entry point for those components in that application. Has a data source and everything that points to some additional Sitecore data that we pass along to that application. And then here's the PDP wildcard. So no matter what you type in, you can come across the same presentational page with the same components, and the PDP service will match a product that is meant for it. It'll either return it or say this isn't found. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to the other scenario, the scenario that was kind of monumental for the business development side of it, and being able to say, yeah, we can support this. So scenario 2 is that app by route scenario, where you have a proxy server and you want to have application, like, those 14 applications control their own routes, but still have Sitecore's implementation side of it working inside of all those applications. That's a head twister in itself. So let's go ahead and let's switch out that branch. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop those. Okay, so locally, how this is going to work is, let me zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to close these so we just have one side here. In my mono repo setup, I have not only those 2 other applications, but I have a proxy. And in this proxy, there's a server file. All that's doing is, I believe, just using Express. Yep, using Express to create a proxy. So depending on from localhost 3002 as your entry point. And if you go to 3002/catalog or playground, it's going to change the target of that port to 3001, which is our catalog application. So if we go to 3002/catalog or playground, this is the example of going into those applications in that port. So I'm going to go ahead and run this just using Node. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's going to run a proxy server on localhost 3002. Right now, there won't be anything on it. What we'll do next is we're going to rerun our catalog application. Okay, that's starting. And then we'll go ahead and rerun the Sitecore application too. Worth noting that there hasn't been, this is on a version of JSS that's probably a couple minor versions behind the existing one. Shouldn't make much of a difference, but it's good to call out. Okay, so the ironic part about this this catalog running is that it needed the ability to access Sitecore, while Sitecore wasn't even, the fetches failed for that remote entry. But it should be okay. Should be okay now. Sometimes you get in those edge cases, not when they're deployed, obviously, but okay. So from a code perspective, what we're looking to do is, from the non-Sitecore application, we want to spin up our own routes, okay? And for example, say one of those 14 Next.js applications had its own catalog route that handled product lists, let's say, okay? So inside of there, they want the ability to use the Sitecore layout in their own application. They want the ability to do everything that Sitecore does during its runtime processing, such as fetch dictionary data using the dictionary provider, fetch site data for site context information, even if it's not for components. And this is what we're going to do. So in this catalog route, you can see here that I'm importing something called Sitecore layout, which maybe you're familiar with, but we're also importing get server-side props. So you can think of not only components in Next.js as modules, but routes themselves are modules, which I didn't know a year ago, but that was the case. So we're importing two different things, module.exports, yada, yada, two different properties as part of that module exports object, that page route from MF marketing, the other way around. So this is from Sitecore, from that layout export. So this is a little bit confusing because I could have called this a little bit differently, but realistically what this means is we're going to use the catch-all dynamic page route. This is really what it's doing. I just labeled it as layout because that's how it's exposed. But what we're doing here is we're importing the dynamic page route module from Sitecore. And we're accessing these two properties of it. So in my scenario, that's going to be the get server side props because that's the server side rendering. And I'm calling that Sitecore get server side props. Okay. So in our catalog application on this catalog route where we want to display featured products and whatnot, I'm going to create a page and I'm going to wrap that page in the Sitecore layout. So you can see here, it says Sitecore layout. I'm importing Sitecore layout because that's an actual object. And I'll show what that looks like on the Sitecore side. And then I'm adding whatever I want on the catalog route right below that. I have two components in there. So by doing this, by embedding the Sitecore layout in there, I'm basically saying that I can include Sitecore's header and footer placeholders, all the components that live inside of there from Sitecore. I don't need to do anything else. One more important thing that you need to be aware of though, just like any Next.js page, because that's what this is, it's just not a catch-all route using page router. I'm also declaring a get server side props, right? So my own, what they would be doing anyways, this, build time or server runtime function was going to run for you when, the page request occurs. In this scenario, I'm telling it to also use Sitecore's get server side props. And it's going to run through all of those plugins that are normally inside of the Sitecore application. Normal mode, dictionary fetching, site fetching, multi-site, if you have those enabled. That's what this props is doing. It's getting all of those props that are necessary for the page. So from a non-Sitecore perspective, we're importing things that are Sitecore related, and we're going to return those here. That's a lot to take in, but I'll show it in a second. There is some important caveats because this is not a dynamic page route. We need to add a params object because apparently, if you don't use a dynamic page route, it's not going to be included in this context property. Not a big deal. It's just something that I saw when the page errored out before it was fixed. If you had a dynamic page route here instead of just a single one, that wouldn't be an issue. Just a weird consequence. So that's from the non-Sitecore side. So from the Sitecore side of it, let's go down into how that's exposed. So from Sitecore's head app, we're going to go into the MF config again. And now this time you're going to see an exposes property here called layout. And this is what I was talking about before, is that this layout actually points to that dynamic path TSX file that we all know and either love or are getting to love. So this is how we're telling Sitecore, I want to expose this in the remote entry of the module federation file so that other applications can have access to it in all of its glory. Okay. So what we'll do now is we'll show this on the front end. Let me go ahead and we'll spin up the localhost 3000 catalog site by itself, just to make sure that's working by itself without the proxy. Because remember, the proxy is on port 3002. The applications are running on their own ports. So I'm just going to go directly to that catalog application and make sure it's actually working. So right now it looks like it's empty. Sometimes this happens. I just need to restart it. So we'll restart that real quick. Looks like this is reloading for me. Okay. So this is the catalog application pulling in the Sitecore header, which you didn't see before. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the proxy, and we're going to request the catalog page. Cool. All right. So what we're doing here is from the proxy server, we are requesting /catalog, and that's routing into the catalog Next.js app. Now, the catalog Next.js app itself normally doesn't have any type of access to the Sitecore layout. But because we changed the implementation by adding in those couple of lines in the catalog route, we have the Sitecore header and everything available there. And inside of the Sitecore header component, we have a catalog component inside of there. So this is literally inception of running Sitecore and its layouts and its components inside of 14 different Next.js applications, so that those can control their own, their own inner content. This was a scenario that we had to use and develop with over 14 different teams to get that working, where they could piecemeal together what they wanted from Sitecore. For example, here, eyeglasses, sunglasses, contacts, all of that's coming from Sitecore. The ES catalog thing is a bug that I haven't figured out yet, but all of these are dictionary items from Sitecore, but this is from the catalog application now and not the rendering host. And then, let's see, there was also the playground application. So if I type in playground, you're going to see a 404 for this. Now, the funny thing, and this is probably a good learning experience for a lot of people, is the reason you're getting a 404 here is this. Let's go into the playground route, right? We have a catalog route and a playground route. The playground route does everything that the catalog route does, but it has different things in it that team wants to control. They have a banner and a counter inside of there, still wrapped inside of the Sitecore layout that I already showed. But because this route, because we're calling all of the Sitecore logic first during this page generation, it's Sitecore's props are going to return us a not found true flag, because this page doesn't actually exist in Sitecore. So if you wanted to, you could pass some additional context properties to Sitecore and tell them, no, I already found this page inside of this app first. So I don't want you to set that not found, and that would work just as well. But that wouldn't be able to show you the header, the Sitecore header on that page. So there's different ways that you could implement that if you don't want this to show the not found. If you want to show the header components and all that, you can go right into Sitecore. I'll go ahead and duplicate that catalog page, and I'll call it playground just to match the route. Okay, so now we have our playground page in Sitecore. Now this, again, this is the non-Sitecore application going to /playground. So what I'll do now is I'll reload this. And there we have it. Sitecore components are outlined in red. Those are coming from that Sitecore get server-side props methodology, and then the counter component and a banner component coming from that application. So it's a really powerful, it's a very powerful framework that can get you in a lot of trouble, right? And you might think you may not have a lot of time or expertise to do that, or the right scenario doesn't exist. But this isn't a one size fits all tool. I think as Vercel starts to adapt it a lot more, we might start hearing about it a lot more, just the way that, you know, microservices caught on, that completely changed how backend and monolithic principles occurred, just like how we went from Sitecore, you know, Sitecore XP to Sitecore XM Cloud. In my scenario, it was a win-win because the client had already had a bunch of different verticals set up, and they didn't want to go through a year's worth of changing out their code to put all of it inside of a Sitecore application. So this is one way of getting around that, and doing everything, still developing things in Sitecore, enhancements for them in your own code, in your Sitecore application, but allowing their Next.js applications to control their own narrative and their own verticals. So that basically precedes that. Does anyone have any questions or comments about how any of that might work?
You showed like that manifest file. What did the manifest file do in the grand scheme of things?
Yep, that's a great question. Yeah, the manifest file is really the mapping. When you're using module federation and you're importing a dynamic component, just like you would on a React lazy module, it's looking to see where that component comes from. And so the component that you're importing, as you saw inside of one of my files here, it says MF marketing, right? This is the block where we're actually importing the entire Sitecore dynamic route, which is kind of an extreme case. But this is where it's going to say, hey, behind the scenes in Webpack, I need to go and find this file. Where the heck is it? So the manifest is where it reaches out to when it finds MF marketing, and it goes to that destination. So MF marketing is on the Sitecore side, right? So we go into Sitecore, we go into the MF config.
So was the manifest built from after the MF configs were built?
The manifest is built during build time.
From looking at the mf.configs?
Yes. Yep.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah. So you can see here, like, if Sitecore needs to import any non-Sitecore components, this is the remote that I need to use, and then here's the actual location. So if you're deploying, I set this up in a way where you can use environment variables. Otherwise, it falls back to local development. So localhost 3001, we knew that was the catalog application. And so that's going to be our remote entry of where it's going to look and sniff out those components to then inject into the Sitecore application, or vice versa the other way.
Then one more question, if you don't mind. So then
Absolutely.
You're able to reference components from other applications in, you know, the other application, and that was because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you used another module that generated the TypeScript types from each application, and that's like how you were able to reference like a Sitecore component in the other application.
Yes, that's why you don't see any ESLint errors inside of the problem area. You don't have to use it. You can declare them yourself. For example, I couldn't generate the type for the Sitecore marketing / layout import that I had here, so I just declared that one myself. But for the most part, yeah, those types are what passes the build, you know, the next lint build, and whatnot. So all of these type files here of componentry all comes from the catalog application, but it was generated inside of our Sitecore application if this is like the route we chose, right? So that's going to be the third scenario, the Sitecore host, where Sitecore is the only host, but we're gonna remotely consume the catalog application components and other components. That's a pretty big popular scenario. but you can also do the app by route, which is the proxy server that I showed last. If you have those, yeah, those 14 different Next.js applications and they don't want to move their code around and put it all into a Sitecore rendering host.
Super cool.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Those were good ones. But again, yeah, all of that's shared on the slide. So throw that out there if you have any questions. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing what Vercel and Zachary Jackson is going to promote and what's coming up for that new features. But I think it's got a good segue into XM Cloud and just the whole composable stack. So thank you everybody for your time.